She did not have a name. Not here. Here, she was only the sum of her parts. The plain gray dress, now torn at the shoulder and smudged with the alkali dust of the plains. The bare feet, cracked and bleeding, pressed into the raw timber of the saloon porch that served as her stage. The white prayer covering, her cap, askew on her head, a flag of surrender. The sun was a hammer, beating down on the town of redemption, a place that had long ago forgotten the meaning of its own name. Flies buzzed a lazy, cruel hymn around her face. She did not flinch. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, were fixed on a point beyond the leering faces, beyond the heat haze shimmering off the dirt street. She had learned to go somewhere else inside herself, a small, quiet room where the world could not follow. A man named Silas Croft, whose smile was as thin and sharp as a shard of glass, stood beside her. He held a length of frayed rope in his hand, the other end of which was looped loosely around her wrist and tied to a porch post. He was not a slaver, not officially. He was an opportunist, a vulture who fed on misfortune. Her family's farm, miles east, had failed. The blight had come first, then the drought. Her father, a man whose faith was as solid and unyielding as granite, had made a deal with Croft for seed and supplies, a deal sealed with a handshake and a prayer. But God, it seemed, had not been listening. When her father and mother succumbed to the fever that followed the hunger, Croft had come to collect. There was no money. There were no assets. There was only her, an Amish girl, an outsider, a strange bird in this land of hard-bitten ranchers and prospectors, an object of curiosity and suspicion. So he'd brought her here, to the center of town, with a story polished to a high shine. An indentured servant, he called her, bound by her father's debt, a good worker, strong, obedient. He did not say she could read the Bible in 2 languages. He did not say she knew the name of every wild herb that could heal a fever or soothe a cough. He did not say that her silence was not stupidity, but a wall built of grief and dignity. The crowd was a hydra of sun-scorched faces. A few women in faded calico dresses watched from the shade of the general store, their expressions a mix of pity and morbid fascination. Men, smelling of sweat and cheap whiskey, spat tobacco juice into the dust, their eyes lingering on her form with a casual, proprietary air. They laughed. They murmured. They appraised her like livestock. "What's the bid for this fine specimen of piety?" Croft's voice was slick with false cheer. "Guaranteed to cause no trouble. Can cook, clean, so think of the help for your wife, fellas." Or other comforts. A low, greasy chuckle rippled through the men closest to the porch. She felt the words like stones, bruising her skin, but she did not permit a single muscle in her face to move. The quiet room inside her grew smaller, the walls thicker. A man in the back, smelling of the forge, yelled out, "I'll give you $20, Silas." "20," Croft scoffed. "For a lifetime of servitude? Don't insult me, Jebediah." The bidding stalled. The curiosity was waning, turning to the afternoon's more pressing thirsts. The sun beat down. The rope chafed her wrist. This, she thought, was the end of the world. Not a bang, not a whisper, but the lazy buzz of a fly and the weight of a dozen careless eyes. Then, a shadow fell across the outer edge of the gathering. He had come into town for salt and flour, nothing more. Elias Thorne moved with the quiet economy of a man who wasted nothing. Not words, not motion, not emotion. He was tall, thin as a fence rail inside a worn duster that had seen more winters than he had. Dust clung to him not like a temporary inconvenience, but like a second skin. He carried whole winters in his eyes, the pale, washed-out blue of a frozen lake. He'd been a somebody once, Elias the Rider Thorne, champion of a dozen rodeos, a man who could dance with a 2,000-pound bull and make it look like ballet. The silver buckle he once wore, shaped like a charging bronc, was a legend, but he didn't wear it anymore. He'd buried it, along with the man he used to be, on a small, windswept hill behind his homestead, next to a woman named Mary and a small stone that marked a future that never was. Now he just ran a few head of cattle, kept to himself, and let the silence of the high plains seep into his bones. He had intended to pass the saloon, to ignore the commotion. It was not his business. The world was full of casual cruelty. To try and stop it all was to try and dam a river with your bare hands. But he saw her. He saw not the object Croft was selling, but the stillness, the impossible, defiant stillness of her. He saw the slight tremble in the hand that was not tied, a tremor she fought to control. He saw the way she held her chin, not high in defiance, but level, as if to say, "You can do this to my body, but you cannot touch the part of me that matters." And in that moment, the frozen lake in his eyes cracked. He saw another woman, another kind of stillness, in a different, quieter room, as a fever stole the light from her eyes. He moved. He did not push through the crowd. He seemed to part it, the men turning as he passed, a quiet respect or perhaps fear in their gaze. He stopped at the foot of the porch steps, his shadow falling over her bare feet. Croft's smile tightened. "Thorn, didn't figure you for this kind of entertainment." Elias ignored him. His gaze met hers for a fraction of a second. He saw fear there, yes, but beneath it, a flicker of something else. A question. He looked at the rope on her wrist, then back at Croft. His voice, when it came, sounded like it came from under floorboards, and used and deep. "I'll take her." Croft's eyebrows shot up. "Well now, the hermit comes down from the mountain. The bidding is at $50, Thorn. Can you meet it?" He knew of Elias's modest means. The question was a barb. Elias did not reach for the worn leather pouch at his belt. Instead, his hand went to an inner pocket of his duster. He pulled out a small, heavy object wrapped in oilcloth. He unwrapped it slowly. It was the buckle. The afternoon sun caught the polished silver, making it blaze with a defiant light. The charging bronc, frozen in motion, seemed to leap from his hand. A gasp went through the crowd. Men who had only heard stories of it now saw the legend in the flesh. It was more than silver. It was history. It was a piece of the man himself. "This," Elias said, his voice flat, emotionless. "This is my bid." Croft stared at the buckle, his greed warring with his surprise. He could sell it for 10 times the price he could ever get for the girl. He could hold it over drinks, tell the story for years. "Done," Croft said, his voice a little too loud. He snatched the buckle from Elias's hand. Elias stepped onto the porch. The crowd was silent now, watching a different kind of spectacle. He did not look at the girl. He simply pulled a small, sharp pocket knife from his belt, and with one clean, upward slice, he cut the rope. The frayed ends fell away. He folded the knife, put it away, and turned, expecting her to follow. He took 2 steps before realizing she hadn't moved. He stopped, his back to her. She stood frozen, her wrist still held in the air as if the rope were a ghost. Freedom was a language she had forgotten how to speak. He didn't turn around. He just waited. The silence stretched, heavy and profound. After a long moment, he heard the soft, hesitant scuff of bare feet on wood behind him. He started walking again, away from the saloon, away from the staring eyes, heading for the edge of town. He didn't look back to see if she was still there. He just listened for the sound of her footsteps in the dust behind him, a quiet, uncertain echo of his own. The journey to his homestead was made in a silence that was more vast than the sky above them. Dust lifted behind them like ghosts of the people they used to be. The wind was the only voice, whispering through the sparse, hardy grass. He walked at a steady, unhurried pace, never once looking back. She followed a dozen feet behind, a phantom in his wake. Her world had shrunk to the sight of his worn leather boots and the straight, unbending line of his back. He was a wall against the horizon, a shield against the town she left behind. An hour into the walk he stopped. Without turning, he unhooked a canteen from his hip and set it on the ground behind him. Then he walked on another 20 paces and stood, his gaze fixed on the distant, hazy mountains. She stared at the metal canteen, gleaming dully in the sun. It was the first act of kindness she had received in a lifetime, or so it felt. Her throat was a desert, her lips cracked. Hesitantly, she moved forward, her shadow falling over the offering. Her hand trembled as she picked it up. The water was warm, metallic, and the most beautiful thing she had ever tasted. She drank slowly, carefully, then screwed the cap back on and placed it back in the exact same spot. When she caught up to her position behind him, he bent down, retrieved the canteen, and began walking again. Not a word was exchanged. None was needed. A contract had been drawn and signed in the dust. His home was not a house. It was a scar on the landscape, a testament to endurance. A small, weathered cabin of graying timber, a leaning barn, and a corral holding a handful of rangy cattle. It was a place that had hunkered down to survive, not to live. The wind seemed to have a permanent hold here, turning mean around the corners of the cabin, rattling a loose shutter in a rhythm of perpetual complaint. On a small rise overlooking the homestead, a simple wooden cross stood silhouetted against the sky. A second, smaller stone was set beside it. She saw it immediately and understood. This was not just a place of isolation. It was a place of ghosts. The silence here was not empty. It was full of things unsaid. Elias led her not to the main door, but to a small lean-to room built against the side of the cabin. The door scraped open on reluctant hinges. Inside it was Spartan but clean. A simple cot with a neatly folded wool blanket, a small table, a wash basin and pitcher, and a single high window looking out onto the endless plains. It was a room that expected nothing. He stood in the doorway, not crossing the threshold, his large frame filling the space. "This is yours," he said. The words were simple, factual. "The rest of the house is mine." She nodded, her eyes on the floor. "I don't lock doors," he added, his voice low. "Not ever." She looked up at that, her gaze meeting his for the second time that day. She saw the truth of the statement in his winter blue eyes. He was not her jailer. He was something else, something she had no name for. He left, pulling the door until it was almost closed, but leaving a sliver of light. She heard his boots cross the main room of the cabin, the sound of a stove lid being lifted. The smell of wood smoke soon followed, and later, the scent of coffee and bacon. She sank onto the cot, the rough wool of the blanket a solid, real thing beneath her fingers. She was free of the rope, but she was bound by something else now, an unspoken debt, a fragile truce. She looked around the small, bare room. It was not a prison. It was a sanctuary, and in the profound, aching quiet of that realization, she finally allowed a single hot tear to trace a clean path through the dust on her cheek. The days that followed fell into a rhythm as quiet and steady as a slow heartbeat. They moved in parallel orbits, rarely intersecting, communicating through the language of completed tasks. He would rise before dawn, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards her alarm clock. He'd be gone for hours, tending his small herd, mending the miles of fence that seemed to be in a constant state of decay. He was stitching his life together with raw thread and rusted wire, and he did it alone. She found her own work. The cabin, she discovered, was clean but not cared for. It was a space a man survived in, not lived in. Dust lay like a fine shroud over everything he didn't use daily. A stack of Mary's things, a sewing basket, a book of pressed flowers, a pair of small, worn shoes, sat in a corner untouched, a shrine of grief. She did not touch them. Instead, she started with the floor. She found a worn broom and swept the packed earth floor of the main room until it was smooth and dark. She washed the few dishes he used, stacking them neatly. She took his work shirts, stiff with sweat and dust, and washed them in a bucket with soap she found under the sink, hanging them on a line he had not used in years. The first time he came in from the fields and saw a clean shirt hanging on a hook by the door, he stopped dead. He looked at it, then at her where she stood by the stove, stirring a pot of thin stew. She didn't look up, but she felt his gaze like a physical weight. He said nothing. He simply took off his dirty shirt and put on the clean one. The gesture was louder than a thank you. One afternoon, while he was gone, she walked up the small hill to the two graves. The wind was relentless here, trying to pull her cap from her hair. The wooden cross was weathered, the name Mary carved into it with a careful hand. The small stone beside it had no name, only a date. She ran her fingers over the carving. She understood the shape of the silence in this house now, the hollow places in his eyes. She found a single, stubborn prairie wildflower, a spot of defiant purple in a world of brown, and laid it at the base of the cross. When he returned that evening, he carried 2 wooden buckets of water from the well instead of his usual one. He set one down just outside her door without a word. Slowly, the house began to change. The air grew warmer. Filled with the scent of the bread she learned to bake in his temperamental oven. The first loaf she made was hard as a rock. He took a bite, chewed for a long, thoughtful moment, and said, "A little dry." She looked at him, startled by the direct comment, a ghost of a smile touching her lips for the first time. "You did not complain about your own," she said, her voice thin from disuse. He almost smiled back. "Mine died in vain. Didn't want yours to suffer the same fate." That night, a storm rolled in, a monster of thunder and lightning that made the little cabin tremble. She lay on her cot, listening to the world being torn apart. A crash of lightning, impossibly close, lit her room in a stark, blue-white flash. A cry escaped her lips before she could stop it, a small animal sound of pure terror. It was the sound of another room, a locked cellar, a father's belt. She heard his boots hit the floor in the next room. Footsteps stopped outside her door. He didn't try the handle. He didn't speak. He just stood there. She could feel his presence through the wood, a solid, silent sentinel. She pulled the blanket up to her chin, her heart hammering against her ribs, and listened to the sound of his quiet breathing, a counterpoint to the raging storm. He stayed there until the thunder faded to a distant rumble and she had fallen into a restless sleep. The next morning, the air was washed clean, smelling of rain and damp earth. She was sweeping the porch when he approached. "Why?" she asked, the word so quiet the wind almost carried it away. She did not look at him, her attention fixed on the patterns the broom made in the dust. "In the town." "Why did you?" He was silent for a long moment, watching the horizon. "My wife, Mary," he began, his voice rough. "She believed that a person's worth wasn't something that could be bought or sold, that it was given by God, and it was absolute." He paused, kicking at a loose stone with the toe of his boot. What that man was doing, it was wrong. It was a sin against the way she saw the world. Couldn't let it stand. It wasn't right. He wasn't saving her. He was honoring his wife. He was defending a principle. The realization settled in her not with disappointment, but with a profound sense of relief. He had not bought a woman. He had righted a wrong. His kindness was not for her, but for a memory, which made it pure. "You're either the kindest man I have ever met," she said softly, "or the most foolish." He looked at her then, a real, slow smile finally reaching his eyes, making the frozen lake of them thaw for just a moment. "Can't I be both?" For the first time since she had arrived, she felt the ground solid beneath her feet. The peace they had built was as fragile as a new seedling, and they both knew it. The harbinger of its destruction appeared not as a man, but as a flicker of unnatural light on the horizon, far to the south, where their property line met the open range. Elias saw it first. He was on the roof of the barn, replacing shingles torn loose by the last storm. When he straightened up, his eyes narrowing. It was a bonfire, too large and too brazen for a simple cattle camp. It was a signal, a claim. He said nothing to her that evening, but a new tension settled in his shoulders. He cleaned his rifle, his movements methodical and grim. He checked the hinges on the doors and windows. He was battening down the hatches, preparing for a storm that had nothing to do with the weather. She watched him, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. She knew who the fire was for. Silas Croft was not a man to let a prize go, especially one he felt he'd been cheated out of. The silver buckle had been an emotional, public victory for Elias, but Croft was a creature of cold, hard currency. He would have stewed on it, his greed and pride curdling into something vengeful. They came 2 days later. 3 riders, dark shapes against the bright morning sun. They did not approach the house directly, but rode a slow, deliberate circle around it, their presence an act of intimidation. Croft was in the lead, a new arrogance in the way he sat his horse. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand, pointed at the ground. He did not raise it. He just stood there, a silent, unmovable object. She watched from the window of her room, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. The old fear, the feeling of being trapped, of being an object to be haggled over, came rushing back. The walls of her small, safe room felt like they were closing in. "Thorn!" Croft called out, his voice carrying easily in the clear air. He reined in his horse a safe distance away. "I've come to renegotiate our deal." "There is no deal to renegotiate." Elias's voice was flat, carrying no more emotion than the wind. "I think there is," Croft sneered. "I've had that buckle appraised. It's fine silver, to be sure, but it's not worth a lifetime of labor. You cheated me, Thorn. You used sentiment to cheapen my property." "She is not property," Elias said, the words quiet but absolute. "The law says otherwise. Indentured servitude, signed and sealed by her own father's debt." Croft gestured behind him. "I'm here to collect what's mine. You can keep your little trinket. I want the girl." The 2 men with Croft shifted, their hands resting on the pistols at their hips. The air grew thick with unspoken violence. The land itself seemed to be holding its breath. Inside, she pressed her hand against the rough wood of the wall. She could stay here. Hide. Let him handle it. It was his fight. He had started it. But the thought turned to ash in her mouth. To hide now would be to agree with Croft. It would be to accept that she was nothing more than an item to be fought over. The bread she had baked that morning was cooling on the counter. The clean shirt of his she had mended hung on its peg. The wildflower on Mary's grave had wilted, but it had been there. This was her home now, not by law, not by purchase, but by the slow, painstaking work of her own 2 hands. She had stitched herself into the fabric of this place. She turned from the window, her decision made. Her eyes fell on the heavy iron poker resting by the cold hearth. Her hand closed around its familiar weight. She walked out of her room, across the main cabin floor, and stepped out onto the porch to stand beside Elias. She did not stand behind him. She stood beside him. The iron poker was heavy in her hand. She did not raise it as a weapon, but held it like a scepter, a symbol of her domain. The hearth. The home. Croft's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in contempt. "Look at that. The little mouse has come out to play." Elias didn't look at her, but she felt the minute shift in his stance, the barest easing of tension. He was no longer standing alone. She looked directly at Silas Croft, and for the first time, she let him see the storm in her eyes. "I am not property," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the wind. "My father's debt is with God. You have no claim here." Croft laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "It's not up to you, little bird. It's a matter between men." He looked at Elias. "Last chance, Thorn. Send her out, or we take her." Elias finally raised the rifle, not to his shoulder, but just enough to show he was serious. "The only thing you'll be taking from this land, Croft, is a hole in the ground if you don't turn your horse around right now." It was a standoff, a moment stretched thin as a spider's web, ready to break. The 2 hired men looked uncertainly from Croft to Elias, then to the woman with the cold fire in her eyes and the iron poker in her hand. This wasn't the easy job they'd signed up for. This place, this man and this woman, they were rooted here. To pull them up would be to tear the world apart. Suddenly, a new sound intruded, the creak of a wagon, the jingle of a harness. A neighbor, Jebediah from the forge, the same man who had bid a paltry $20 for her, was coming up the track, his face a mask of curiosity. He took in the scene, Elias and the woman on the porch, Croft and his men in the yard, and his eyes widened. He pulled his wagon to a halt. Croft saw him. He saw the equation change. What was a private matter was now a public spectacle. He saw the unyielding set of Elias's jaw. He saw the defiant stillness of the woman. And in their unified front, he saw his own cowardice reflected back at him. It wasn't worth it. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a sullen, bitter resentment. He spat on the ground. This ain't over, Thorn, but the threat was hollow. He yanked his horse's reins, turning it so sharply it whinnied in protest, and galloped away, his 2 men trailing behind him like dogs. The dust they kicked up settled slowly. Jebediah, seeing the danger had passed, gave a hesitant nod and clicked his own horses into motion, continuing on his way. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was clean, victorious. Elias lowered the rifle. He turned and looked at her, really looked at her. He saw not the frightened girl from the auction block, but the woman who had stood beside him, who had claimed her own voice. "I was scared," he admitted, the words raw and honest. "I know," she said softly. "So was I." His gaze fell to the iron poker still gripped in her hand. A slow, tired smile touched his lips. He reached out not to take it from her, but to gently lay his rough, calloused hand over hers, his fingers covering her white knuckles. It was the first time they had ever touched. His hand was warm and solid. "You didn't run," he said. "No," she replied, her voice full of a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I'm home." The touch lingered for a moment, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had just passed between them, of everything that was now possible. Then he let go, and they stood together on the porch, watching the last of the dust settle, as the house behind them seemed to take a deep, contented breath. In the quiet that followed, the world felt new. The air was sweeter, the vast sky a comfort instead of a threat. The confrontation had not broken them. It had forged them into something new. That evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence between them was no longer a space of caution, but one of comfortable companionship. He looked at her across the flickering flames, at the woman who had faced down her own demon in his front yard. For weeks, he had called her ma'am or nothing at all, respecting the namelessness she had arrived with. But that person was gone, burned away in the heat of the standoff. "I don't know your name," he said simply. It was not a demand. It was an invitation. She looked into the fire, watching the embers glow and fade. She had not said her name aloud in so long. It felt like a foreign word. To say it would be to claim herself fully, to close the door on the silent, frightened girl on the auction block forever. "Lena," she said, her voice soft but clear as a bell. "My name is Lena." Elias tasted the name, let it settle in the quiet room. "Lena," he repeated. It sounded like strength and grace, sounded like home. The saying of her name was the final stone being laid in the foundation of their new life. The next day she did something bold. She went to the corner of the main room where Mary's things lay under their shroud of dust. With a gentle hand, she picked up the book of pressed flowers. She did not open it. She carried it to his small bookshelf and placed it between a worn Bible and a farmer's almanac. It was no longer a shrine in a corner. It was part of the house now, a memory integrated, not isolated. He saw her do it, and he nodded, a quiet, grateful acknowledgement in his eyes. The ghosts of this house were finally being laid to rest, not by forgetting, but by making room. That week, he began fixing the porch step that had been loose for years. She started a small garden near the well, turning over the hard soil and planting the few seeds she'd found in the pantry. They were stitching their lives together, no longer with raw thread, but with strong, deliberate strands. They were building something that might last. Fire only changes everything if something new is waiting in the ash. Weeks turned into a season. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The small garden yielded a surprising bounty of squash and beans. The house was no longer a hollow, echoing space. It breathed. It was filled with the smell of baking bread, the sound of a woman's quiet humming, the steady presence of a man who was slowly finding his way back to the world. One evening, they sat together on the newly repaired porch, watching the sun bleed a palette of blood orange and bruised purple across the horizon. It was a comfortable ritual they had developed, a silent sharing of the day's end. "You know," Elias said into the quiet, his voice thoughtful, "that buckle, it was for a ride they called the Widowmaker. I always thought it was just a name, but after Mary, I realized it was true. It made a widower out of me, not of my wife, but of my spirit." He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. "Giving it away. I think it was the first time I was free of it." Lena listened, her heart full. He had freed her, and in doing so, he had freed himself. She reached over and placed her hand on his arm, her touch now familiar and easy. "A person's worth," she said, echoing his own words back to him, "is not something that can be bought or sold." He looked at her, and the last of the winter finally melted from his eyes, leaving only the clear, steady blue of a summer sky. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile that transformed his weathered face. "No," he agreed softly, "it is not." They sat there in the gathering dusk, two solitary souls who had found their reflection in each other's scars. They had started with nothing but silence and dust, and had built a life on a foundation of quiet kindness. The house stood behind them, a warm and sturdy sanctuary against the vast, lonely plains. No longer a place of ghosts, but a home, finally, truly, alive. This story, it ain't just about rescue. It's not about a strong man saving a damsel. That's the easy tale to tell. This is the harder one. It's about two people, broken in their own quiet ways, who stood side by side and found the missing pieces of their own souls in the other's keeping. See, real strength ain't about the punch you throw. It's about the line you draw in the dust and the person you're willing to stand beside on that line. It's about having the courage to give away the one thing you think defines you, like an old silver buckle, to reclaim the person you were meant to be. And a name is a powerful thing. It's the first piece of property you ever truly own. When someone tries to strip it from you, they are trying to steal your story. The bravest thing you can ever do is to look them in the eye and speak it aloud, to claim it back. So here's your naming, for your own story. Because out there, in the quiet, dusty corners of your own life, there are things worth standing for. There are silent acts of kindness waiting to be given and received. And if you're brave enough to offer a little water to a stranger, if you're brave enough to stand on that porch and say, "No more," you might just find that you're not building a shelter. You're building a home.